All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us here. I'm Jason Carrion from Quartz. We're here to talk about the fundamentals and the infinite possibilities of universal basic income. It's one of the few policy ideas, I think, that have something of broad support across the political spectrum, which is a pretty rare commodity these days. So it's definitely worth us sort of chewing it over here. They explained a bit about what it is, but this is kind of unconditional money given to every citizen that would make it universal. There's no strings attached. It would replace a lot of the welfare state, perhaps. That's kind of the core of it. So some advocates would see it as reducing state bureaucracy. Some would see it as supporting like the working poor or people who have trouble getting jobs. It could support people who lose their jobs to automation and technology, and I think that's why we're probably talking about it here, and that's why basic income seems to be having a moment now, I think, because a lot of sort of Silicon Valley firms are getting involved. A lot of other people at the coal face, so to speak, of technology see what it could do to the labor market, and that means that maybe there won't be as many jobs as there are now, or it could be for some other purpose or a combination of factors. So to put it in terms that I think maybe are more appropriate to this type of gathering, one of our panelists has described basic income. It could be a way to rewrite the source code of the state. Ropa, you said that it could be the operating system of the post-industrial state, which I think is a pretty cool term. So I'm joined by my panel here, Ropa, Albert, and Matt, to talk about basic income. There's some very interesting things happening both in Finland and in Silicon Valley. We have two people here from that. Just to sort of run through really quickly. In Finland, starting next year, we have a pilot where 2,000 people will get 560 euros a month. That's right? Yeah. And then starting in Oakland, California, we have a sort of pilot study where 100 people will get $1,500 a month in preparation for a study where 1,000 people will get sort of that amount. And there's similar experiments happening in the Netherlands, Canada, other types of places. So that's the background. Albert, I wanted to start with you with a slightly controversial question, perhaps. The techies getting very involved in basic income at the moment is it's a worthy goal, obviously, but is this the kind of techno-utopian overreach? They see the government, they see the welfare state as something to be disrupted, like food delivery, like taxis. I mean, this is really, really big. Are they overstepping themselves a bit with taking this on?
Well, I think, as you said at the beginning, people are coming at this from very different angles, right? And there's definitely people who see this as a much simpler system, one that can be administered by computers, and that's appealing to some people. But I think the reason why people in technology see this as interesting is because in the things that we invest in and the things that we build, we can kind of see the future approaching maybe faster than you can see it when you're further away from these types of companies. So we recently invested in a company called Clarify that does image recognition as a service. And if you take image recognition as a task, until about 5 years ago, computers really sucked at it. I mean, they were just terrible at it. And we've gone from computers being really terrible at it to computers being really, really good at it in the space of 5 years. And so I think people who work in technology see this kind of progress and the rate of that progress much more clearly in front of us. And so I think we're thinking as a result much more about, okay, what does that all mean? And how can we set ourselves up so that we can embrace this, so that this can be a good thing as opposed to something that we need to be afraid of?
Yeah. The Finnish example, which Demos Helsinki was very much involved in, was pitched as a way to promote work, which to me seems almost the exact opposite, with some of the people in tech saying there will be no jobs, the robots will take them all. So can you reconcile those two?
Yeah, they are absolutely kind of opposites, and that's what makes basic income as an idea so beautiful. Kind of the Silicon Valley or the technology driven idea, which I've totally subscribe to is that we're not going to see many of the jobs that we have now. The nature of profession even is going to change and so forth. So we need to replace income with something. And however, the Finnish government is looking at it from a totally different point of view because, Robert Solov says that you get growth by looking at how much employment there is, how much labor there is in the market, and how sophisticated the labor is. And you put capital on that and growth comes. And now the Finnish government is trying to get the economy growing. It's not growing fast enough, nearly fast enough here. So they think that by increasing the amount of labor in the market, you can get the economy growing. And why do they think that basic income is a tool for that? Quite simply because we already have quite a good basic income, but it's just in hundreds of different types of instruments you have to apply for. And that means that you never really know whether you're better off not taking the job than you would be in taking a job. For example, driving an Uber or something that is slightly less secure. So this is from the Finnish government is doing the same experiment for the totally different reasons. And that's what makes it of course, interesting to have this conversation, for example.
So the Y Combinator experiment in Oakland, I mean, you guys are obviously a technology investor firm, this kind of thing. I mean, when hearing what the Finns are doing, how do you reconcile that there? You are surveying the people when they, every month, I think it is. I mean, we're not human because we have jobs, but work also gives us a sense of identity and community and that kind of thing. I mean, what sort of questions are you dealing with there or hoping to discover from your pilot, let's say, around the nature of work and how it, culturally affects us?
Yeah, so our study is very focused on the individual effects of understanding basic income, trying to really see how it could improve people's economic security, how people will be spending their time. I do think it's absolutely very complementary with what the Finnish government is doing as well. And I think one thing to think about it too in the context of technological change and how the jobs could be going away at some point, it's not going to be this instant thing overnight that's just going to suddenly happen. It's going to be this sudden gradient that, job security will erode at first. Already in the US, we see many types of jobs switching to contract type of labor that's less secure than full employment with benefits. And then we also see positive effects where the costs of lots of things are driven down by this type of technological advancement as well, where many things become more affordable and just the concept of basic income becomes more affordable as well. So I think we'll see this gradient over time where there will be more room to expand the idea of the social safety net and the form of social safety net itself, and we'll be working towards these types of things gradually.
Okay. I wanted to just jump in on this. I think the point you made is spot on. There's a lot of the existing welfare programs all around the world have a weird structure where they disincentivize work because if you start to work, you lose all your benefits. And so you face sort of this cliff. And I think one thing that people often don't understand about basic income is that basic income doesn't prevent you from working. And every dollar you earn is a dollar on top of your basic income. And so it doesn't have that same kind of weird cliff structure and disincentive. I also thought that the introductory comment before we came on stage was super spot on, which is there's certain types of labor supply that require you to take risk. So if you want to become an independent provider, of like education services or counseling services, you need to be able to sustain some fluctuations in your income. You may or may not have clients at any one point in time, and so basic income will enable a lot of people to be supplying entrepreneurial labor, so to speak, in whole new efforts. And many of these are efforts where we are going to want a human, not a machine. Like if I want to go talk to somebody about a problem I'm having, if I want to coach, for instance, I'm probably going to want to talk to a human and not a machine.
Yeah. We had talked earlier about, and you were saying that part of something that could happen from having a basic income or these types of experiments is that labor becomes more expensive, that you have this walk away option. I think you talked about, and that being a good thing, which for many executives, or they're not thinking that way, but for society as a whole, that might be the goal.
Yeah, so
And-
I think when people look at labor unions and the history of labor, they often go, oh, well, it was bad because labor unions made labor expensive. But when we made labor expensive in Europe, we also created capital. That is, we created a need to invest in machines. If you look at economies like India that had very cheap, very abundant labor, you didn't have capital accumulation. And so one reason to give people a walk-away option from driving a truck or a walk-away option from flipping burgers at McDonald's is because those are areas that we can and should automate. And then there are other areas like, coaching or education, childcare, et cetera, that in fact we don't want to automate, even if we could. And so if we have cheap labor in some places, we will tie humans up in activities that aren't great human activities to begin with.
Yeah,
I absolutely agree. I think labor should be expensive. If something should be expensive, it's our time, our benefit, and that's a no-brainer. We have now an immense amount of jobs that one could really quite easily automate. Jobs that do not require or benefit from human interaction. It's even degrading to have human interaction in one of these things. We have people who wash cars. You have people, you give them money, and then you have 7 people coming, you wash cars. We have people who, take your order when you want hamburgers. We have, things like that that clearly do not add value and should of course therefore be abolished. However, the problem is that work is the primary way through which people relate to the society. And that is something that I don't think, that is a conversation that we haven't had yet. And that's a fundamental conversation. And basic income is of course kind of like one toolbox, tool in the box through which we can renew the whole concept of work and whole concept of how people relate to the society. But now I don't think our vision there is ready yet, because our vision is that let robots do the dirty work and we'll give the displaced people basic income. There's something missing, There's missing the part that how do you then relate to the society if you're not working? And we might be buying that, but I don't think the majority of the people will be buying that. If we look at the political climate nowadays, it's very much driven by populism that feeds from these type of ideas that, we'll have robots or Chinese to kind of replace you as workers. So we are in, and this is what I meant by saying that it could be the moonshot, because it kind of reveals such a massive change. There was nothing in the moon, but still people wanted to go there, and it kind of galvanized them, and it created a movement of progress from science to politics to capital that then created USA as the kind of leader in that kind of forward-looking thinking. However, my point is that basic income is kind of a must. It has to happen. However, at the same time as we work on that, we should be trying to think of okay, so how will people relate to the society when there isn't any factory jobs, service jobs, there's human interaction jobs, but some of them might be also kind of at least assisted by AI and so forth.
I think that's often the criticism of thinking about basic income in the context of all of the jobs really being replaced with something conceptually like basic income. People just won't have meaning in their lives. I think that aspect of meaning can't really be centrally planned the way that basic income potentially could be. I think we can establish the safety net for people so they will definitely be able to be taken care of. And I don't know how much that ameliorates the problems you kind of mentioned around populist movements that are very worried about these types of things. But the aspect of meanings and how people would really reorganize themselves, I think we just have to see to some degree how that would play out. I don't think we can really pre-plan for that too heavily.
Yeah. Well, one thing I'm interested to ask you all. We're here talking about basic income at a tech conference, which I think is kind of telling. It's definitely sort of having a moment. I think it's been around. These ideas have been around for centuries, but it seems quite hot, quite trendy. at the moment. And I think it seems to me quite intentionally on the Finnish side and also on the Silicon Valley side that after some great fanfare around we're doing these big pilots, this is actually happening now in practice. You guys have gone maybe a bit more quiet. And we were talking earlier about how it's best maybe not to get ahead of ourselves on this, and this is like a very long-term project, and the hype cycle, as if this was an app or a new social network or something, could end up kind of thwarting interest in it. That if these studies drag, then people will be like, basic income, it doesn't work. But and I think that gets back to my first question, that this is like a bigger thing than just disrupting government or something like that.
Yeah.
I mean, is that?
I think the fact that this is talked about is obviously good, but what's missing from the conversation is the idea of like, okay, if this is on the hype cycle, how long it will take for it to penetrate? My guess is 15 years or something like that. What we have to understand is the scale of it. That we're at the very core of the state, handing out something that is universal. There hasn't been anything universal in our generation. It has been all the kind of renewals to the state have been to do with some specific group. They had been kind of tweaks to the system, if you like. The last universals have been made in the 70s, at least in the Europe. And then it's just been kind of like making sure that this special group gets access to that service, or this thing gets more of regulated. It hasn't been universal, so that's one. Secondly, it's about handing money. It's not just any kind of thing. It's something that creates contracts between people. Usually, that's what kind of money does essentially. And thirdly, it's the biggest part of any stage budget. Is the social welfare and health, of course, a budget. So we are here in something like more like creating a new operating system than an app. It's something that will take quite a long time. So, of course, the worry about if everyone starts talking about it now, and then they will look at these two experiments and say that, okay, they tried it, but I don't know. I guess there will be 3, 4, 5 experiments in Finland if they really want to do it, to be able to gather enough data about anything really to do with basic income.
Yeah.
I think the reason in my mind why the change will really take a long time is because we've just been 200 years establishing a narrative about how important work is to people's identity. We've created things like the Protestant work ethic. We've woven it into religion, into culture, into our everyday lives, into the education system. The education system is very heavily skewed towards equipping people for work as opposed to, let's say, equipping people to appreciate art or knowledge for its own sake. And so we have woven this so deeply into the fabric of society that undoing that, what we've done over 200 years, will not happen in a month or a year.
Right. Speaking to that kind of point, is there kind of a branding issue and a narrative around this that will help it persist if this is going to take a long time? If it has to survive, for example, different political administrations, which is always a dicey proposition. I mean, what's the sort of narrative around basic income? Like money for nothing, free money, all that kind of stuff gets a little tricky. We could talk about things like negative income tax, inclusive social security. Someone mentioned it to me. So there's just this specific branding.
Seed money for the people.
Narrative. What's that?
Seed money for the people.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. I actually think it could benefit from going the opposite type of direction, becoming something that's slightly more mundane in the shorter term, and we could see something that approximates the idea of basic income much sooner, perhaps with a smaller amount of money. I think, just the idea of unconditional cash as a form of safety net, that's something the organization Give Directly has been doing a lot of work on and has been showing in a developing context is very promising. I think, at least in a US context, the idea of just giving people cash for nothing is highly stigmatized, at least with a large portion of the population. But I think if we switch the conversation to something like that, we're just even in addition to the existing safety net we have, we're giving people $1,000, $2,000 who might be the most needy type of people, and it proves to be a very beneficial type of safety net, then that really lays out the piping for getting to something like large-scale basic income the way people think about it, as we're discussing in a sooner context, I think.
Yeah, I tend to agree with both of you. I think the ultimate problem is that it's very difficult to experiment with framing. you can only get it right once, and then, if it fails, it fails. I like the idea of seed money, for citizens, for people. And then I would like to see something that people could kind of report what they have done. I don't mean that it would be conditional, but they could say, this month I've done this type of a thing. It would be some kind of like qualitative reporting or something. They would post that I've taken these kids to school, or whatever it happens to be. My activities have been like this, to get some kind of conversation going on about that, what activity is, which is like post-work society, so activity.
Is this not a populist policy, giving everyone money?
Well, I think that, one of the nice things in U.S. history is to trace back this idea all the way to the founding fathers, right? I just called it seed money. The word that we haven't talked about is freedom yet. And I do think it fundamentally frees people up, right? It frees people up to be completely free about how they allocate their time. And in the early history of the United States, we're a country of immigrants. I'm an immigrant to the United States. But in the early history of immigration, there was land. Land we obviously had taken away from Native Americans, but there was land. And so the idea was that the seed thing that you would get is you would get a plot of land, and that plot of land would give you freedom to live freely from, the aristocracies that people were fleeing in Europe. And Thomas Paine was one of the first ones to point out that you're going to run out of land at some point, and what are you going to give people then to make them free? And so, to me, some framing around this is about freedom and individual freedom is central to this idea.
It's like post-industrial pioneers or homesteading or something. Yeah. How is Y Combinator, who I think is the furthest along in terms of like a privately run basic income experiment, how much is the political climate affecting you, or how much are you thinking about how this will eventually, or should it inform when this needs to scale and governments need to get involved? I mean, are you just testing it kind of in theory, see if it works, and then hopefully the officials can learn some lessons? Or
my hope is we're designing it in a context that won't necessarily jump to implementing into policy right after the study we do, but would be appealing enough in a way that it could jump to a government scale type study after that, be it partnering with a state of California or the federal government to do a much larger scale study. I think we are trying to make sure that everything we're doing with the study is policy relevant in that sense.
Yeah, and you had mentioned to me earlier too, which I found very interesting, is that some of the people who are in the pilot now were unbanked before, and you give them a bank account and give them cash and stuff, and that seems to me to be kind of an important kind of side effect in a way.
Yeah, no, it's a very interesting ancillary effect of how we've designed the study, at least thus far. It is a huge problem with many poor populations in the US. They are completely underbanked still. They don't have any access to bank accounts. And as a necessity of the study, we do need an easy mechanism to be giving people bank accounts. So we've actually partnered with a company, Green Dot, that focuses on this type of problem to be giving people bank accounts in the study. And we'll see what type of effects that even has in participants' well-being as well.
And so with that too, if I'm right, you guys running the study see the transactions of these people and what they're doing and that kind of stuff as part of the experiment. Mm-hmm. That seems to me like that might not scale a bit kind of like Big Brother-ish, or you do not think of it that way?
Well, that's something we're testing right now with the pilot. We'll see if it's actually relevant or not. There's some concern too with actually tracking transaction data that a lot of people end up pulling the income back into cash where we can't even really see what they're doing. So we'll have to see how that plays out over the coming months to see if it's something we want to play into the main study as well. Yeah.
Also speaking about the politics of this, I mean, the sort of no strings attached, all that kind of stuff. Is there any, you had mentioned, you hinted at it, is it more politically palatable when there's some participation, you have to do something to get it, even if it's not work? How are the Finns thinking about that? About like participation. There's unconditional cash transfers, but I think to scale it, it seems to me like there needs to be some kind of contribution.
I think there's been surprisingly little talk about that.
Huh.
Finns are surprisingly little worried about people not doing anything, because obviously we have a quite good benefit system. If you don't live in one of the big cities, you can live without a job. Absolutely no problem. You won't live a fancy life, but you can support yourself. The basic stuff is there. So there hasn't been much discussion about, how can we hand out money without expecting anything? Because we're doing it already. We have done it for 50 years or so. So there hasn't been much talk about that. I don't like the idea of too much participation, but I said I would like to, people start, it's more like a framing issue, that people start thinking that, now that I have this money, where can I use my freedom? Because it's like one thing to have the freedom and the other one is to use it somehow, and to get that kind of thinking going, I don't know what it is, but there needs to be some kind of forum for that. In the same sense that, if you invest in a company, they are going to report kind of like what have they done with their product, but you're not going to make them, be quantitative about how to report.
I mean, you've been involved in unconditional cash transfers, and that's interesting to you. And you talked about freedom earlier. I mean, what is your current thinking on whether people need to prove that they're doing something?
No, I think people who belong to a civil society and who follow the laws of that society, who participate in politics and democracy, those are all things that people should be doing, and in my mind is the kind of participation that we want. I really would not like a government program where government says, and now you need to work here or there, because I think government historically has been a very bad allocator of people's time. So I think, something we haven't talked about yet is, it's dangerous in my mind to see basic income as some kind of panacea that's going to solve all problems. When we went from the agrarian age to the industrial age, we changed almost everything about how we live. So we went from living in villages and working in farms to living in cities and working in factories. We lived in large extended families. We went to nuclear families or living by ourselves. So we changed. We didn't have formal schooling. We went to formal schooling. We changed lots and lots of things around. And I think we have to recognize that the change we're going through now, that is as big a transition as the traditional transition from the agrarian age to the industrial age. So, for instance, we haven't talked about education. Education needs to change fairly fundamentally along with this change. Give Directly, which has been doing unconditional cash transfers in Africa for some time, one of the things they found is that just a little bit of education going along with the money, saying, hey, we're giving you some money, here's some ideas of what you could do with it, totally changes the outcome. Yes. So compared to just saying, here's a bunch of money. So I think we have to think about this much more broadly. There's a lot of accompanying policy and social changes that have to happen.
Yeah, big ideas. We're just about running out of time, but I wanted to ask everyone to just kind of wrap up. What realistically sort of time frame are we talking about here before some notion of basic income becomes a common government policy? And never is also an answer, but I imagine none of you will say that. But let's go around there.
I would say if everything goes super well, in 5 years' time, we're going to have some kind of form of basic income. When we get to universal basic income, I think it takes minimum 15 years for it to happen.
Over, under 50 years? What do you think?
I'm hoping within my lifetime. Okay. And I'm leaving open how long I hope that will be.
I think as soon as 3 to 5 years, we could have some form of unconditional cash type policy, at least being tested on a larger scale, state by state in the US.
Yeah. Fascinating. Well, great. Well, I wanted to thank Ropa, Albert, and Matt for talking about this, and thank you very much for having us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks.